Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. Alex, who have we got on today?
Today we're going to be talking about one of our favourite things, which is food. Yay! We have Kate Owen with us, who's a PhD student at UCL, and she specialises in early modern manuscript recipe books, which is just going to be fascinating. How do you end up, hello Kate, by the way, but how do you end up down this rabbit hole?
So I was introduced to recipe books through my master's course, actually. So I did a course at King's College London called Early Modern English Literature, Text and Transmission, which was super focused on the materiality of text and how the way they're made or how they are physically impacts how they're used. So it was really perfect for me because I'm one of those people that just can't pick one thing to be interested in.
Yep. That's me.
So I saw them at a guest lecture at Wellcome Collection, and it, like, the rest is literally history. Like, I've just been absorbed into them since.
Brilliant. Yeah, I want all the rabbit holes as well. Alina just likes 5 years in one area of Europe in World War II, so she's fine. She doesn't do the rabbit holes. But no, that's brilliant. Oh, so I just talk to us about your sources before we get started. I know, like, we've got a list of questions. I'm like, wow, how many of them survive? And what's early modern by definition?
Quite a lot of them, more than you would think, survive, but that has to do with kind of who made them and what they were used for, which we can get onto later. I tend to look at recipe books that are kind of 16th, 17th century, because that's when kind of conventions and how you write your recipe book and what you use it for are kind of well established, but they have a long history, kind of from the medieval Book of Secrets, kind of all that, books full of different knowledges and recipes to do things, and kind of I look at more of the 17th century domestic household recipe books.
Oh, one more diversion before we start the actual list of questions. What's the oldest recipe you've seen?
I've handled medieval recipe books, so I could probably say then, but a lot of recipe books, even in kind of the later ones, have earlier sources. So even though they're not written down in like classical times, there are sometimes recipes that have been interpreted for early modern audiences that have a long history.
Can I diverge on one question now? I think you started a bowl rolling, Alex. This is your fault.
Are you going to mention cake because it's you?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Right.
Actually, I'm going to say, have you tried any of them?
Yeah. I have.
That's the first thing you've got to do, right?
It actually is. And the first thing I ever made was a posset, which was an absolute big mistake because they are kind of drinks that are made from like hot alcohol, like wine or ale, with curdled milk in. I know, and they were purported to have kind of like medicinal purposes depending on what you put in them, but also they're quite good for, like, if you're sick and you can't eat anything, they're quite fortifying because you can put cream and eggs and so. But what I do now is I tend to stick to the biscuits and the cakes and the things that I could actually eat.
What's the rankest recipe you've ever seen?
I think that might be it.
Yeah.
The rankest. There's lots of spices that you wouldn't put together that I see quite a lot.
Is that because of like this is days before refrigeration, isn't it? So it's as much about preservation as it is about taste.
That was thought for like a really long time, but they think it was actually just their tastes. For example, like, because spices also had a bit of reputation to them if you could get some of the rarer ones. And early modern food was just full of these spice combinations that you just wouldn't put together. And it wasn't until kind of the French were like, we should go back to using food as natural as possible and just with their natural flavors. So when people say English cooking is bad, I kind of think it's the French's fault. And then they have all their Michelin stars.
Yeah. What's the worst combination you've seen?
So just things that I think the delineation between like what we'd use for a dessert and what we'd use for a main. So like you'll have, cinnamon and sweet things within recipes that have meat, which I have not made and I don't think I will be. But in terms of gross ingredients, especially medieval recipes, you have a lot of things like lampreys and eels and things that I just would not eat.
Yeah.
When you were saying about combining certain spices, all that was flashing through my mind was combining cinnamon and, for example, parsley. And I'm thinking that's probably just the most grossest thing you could possibly ever do.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe not the very grossest of all the things in the whole world, but it does sound pretty gross.
With the spices, that's the kind of thing I'm going for, the kind of gross spice combinations. What could you put together? Like maybe hot paprika and...
Oh, God, just anything with fresh coriander would make me gag.
Oh, you're one of those.
Yeah, I'm one of those people with highly attuned taste buds that realise that it's technically poisonous.
I like coriander, within reason, obviously.
That's because you have amateur taste buds. Do you know what? That's what it is. That's why people are repulsed by it, because if you ate enough of it in like fistfuls, it is poisonous. So that's my highly attuned taste buds rejecting the rankness of coriander.
You've evolved.
I'm more highly evolved than you, Alina, is what I'm saying.
Does it taste like soap to you?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that it's a genetic thing, isn't it? I've read. So
yeah.
Genetically superior, not going to get poisoned by having a massive salad.
Yeah. Whereas Alina is likely to come home from the pub one day and eat so much coriander that she dies.
See, for me, it's I can't stand sage. I think it's absolutely vile. I would not put it into any of my cooking.
But what about stuffing?
No, I won't have it. I make my own stuffing. I do leek and apple stuffing instead.
Weirdo. Should we actually get on with the questions?
Yeah.
Instead of just bombarding Kate with randomness. What are manuscript recipe books?
So I think distilled right down to define them, it's probably notebooks with handwritten recipes within them. But because they are manuscripts and they've been produced by the people that are going to use them, or at least initially the people that are going to use them, they are so diverse in content because they reflect that person's needs. So I've dealt with ones that are more professional. So there might be a doctor's recipe book, which is purely medicinal and just all the stuff he'd need to do his job. But I tend to deal with household recipe books, like domestic ones that kind of reflect the needs of the families and the households that use them.
So who actually owned, I mean, this is such a silly question, but who actually owned these recipe books?
So it's not. I think people think, oh, recipe books, we all have recipe books, so they just must have been used by everybody. And when I went into recipe books, I think I was naive and I was like, I'm going to learn all about just the ordinary person and their cooking and their medical knowledge. But really, they are quite a middle upper gentry class endeavour. And that's for a few reasons. So you have to have, the knowledge of how to read and write, to write them down. You need the resources, so paper, ink. If you're going to use them, if you're going to use the recipes, you need ingredients. And some people got really into things like distilling and making things that lasted a long time. So you need the storage. And it also became like quite a good pursuit to have if you were kind of the gentry classes. So it was quite a good thing to do, to get a reputation for having, I'm good at recipes, I'm good at medicine, I'm good at cooking. So it became quite a good gentleman pursuit to have.
That's really good. So, yeah, I guess working class people wouldn't have had recipe books, would they? All be in their head.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point as well. I think some people make the mistake that if you read one of these books, you know everything that's happened in the household, but there were different ways of getting knowledge. And when you have recipe books, the recipes in there might not be the stuff that's every day, because, for example, I'm not going to write in a recipe book how I make a piece of toast because it's just common knowledge. But they might have written down recipes on scraps or had their own kind of notebooks. But the way that this genre in particular is they were often made to be shown to other people or to be passed down. So they want them to survive. And I think that could be the difference as well.
Right. Talking about layouts.
Yeah.
I've got it in my mind that it's just the simplistic, here is recipe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Am I right? Or am I completely off the mark?
No, they're much messier and just mad, much more mad than that. So there's loads of different ways to set out a recipe book. I've seen, you might have a notebook that actually was something else before it was a recipe book. So it's just full of different stuff. You might have a really nice presentation copy where you've basically put all your nicest recipes in one book and made sure your handwriting was really nice. and you might split it between, you might have the front of the book is medicinal recipes, and you flip over the book and work from the back, and then that side could be the culinary. Or you might have an index and just everything is just assorted inside of, I've just written down recipes as I've found them and as I've wanted to write them down. But quite often you do get groupings. So you might have all your preserves in one section, and then a particular ailment, you might have all the recipes to deal with that in another. But they are quite messy.
So you've mentioned medicinal. Is that basically the two blocks you get? Because obviously this is sort of pre-chemist, pre-drug obsessed. So those are the two blocks you have. You have the medicinal stuff that's supposed to benefit you, and then you have the sustenance that's supposed to feed you. Is it a very definite divide between those two, or do you find other things as well?
You find lots of other stuff. So it might just be that the book contains everything you might need in your household. So ink is a really common recipe. If you have lots of land, you might have veterinary recipes or horticulture recipes. But even in the distinction between food and medicine, doesn't always work at the time, because at this time people still ate to what they thought their constitution was in terms of the four humours. So actually, if you have an ailment, you might eat to cure it. So the delineation between food and medicine also doesn't always exist, but you still get recipes that are clearly for, you're having people around and you want to do something really cool.
So when we think of recipes, like for example, my grandfather's passed down recipes that have been in the family or that he's created, down and down and down. But where do these people get their recipes from?
They could definitely get them from family as well. And especially as these recipe books, if they were passed down, then the recipient of that book can look back and see what previous people have done. But you could get recipes yourself from printed books or printed media. So if you have a cookbook, you might just pick a recipe from it that you want to try and you write it in your recipe book. Or when these recipe books kind of get to further in their lifespan, you could have cutouts from newspapers glued in. But also you could exchange recipes with other people. And that's what I find really interesting, because you could use them as a way to social network. So you could say, someone might ask for a recipe or say, oh, I need to make this. And you're like, well, actually, I have a really good recipe for that. And you can give it to them and kind of use it for clout, as the people say.
Yeah. I have to ask as well, do you find evidence of like crazes for certain periods?
Yeah, definitely. So especially with ones that have, when we were talking about really spiced recipes, that you can definitely see in the kind of older sections, you'll see lots of stuff that uses lots of different spices. And then as you go on, you'll kind of have like the simpler foods. So you can definitely track how people were consuming stuff, both in terms of like medical consumption of all the buying practices of different medicines, but also for food. And there's been some really good research recently. I was listening to a conference where someone was saying you can kind of track kind of the use of things like sugar, which is so tied to, the creation of the slave trade and colonialism. And you can track that even within these personal recipe books that just, the middling and upper classes might have had. So they actually are really interesting resources for so many different things.
How did these recipes, sorry, I'm losing my language today. How did these recipe books document day-to-day life?
They definitely did in some ways, but it's, as I said before, sometimes the absences that were in recipe books are really important. For example, in recipes themselves, there's quite a lot of assumed knowledge. So we were talking about making recipes. Well, sometimes when I make them as a 21st century person, I have no idea, even though the recipe's in front of me, what I'm doing. Because there's an element of everyday life that you don't need to put in a recipe book. So for example, when I look at, pick a chef, Nigella, she's having a moment. So she has a recipe and it says, whisk 2 eggs. I know not to throw 2 eggs in their shells in a bowl and smash them all with a whisk. So there's stuff like everyday cooking and everyday life that aren't on recipe books because they didn't need to be. So for example, when I was talking about making a posset, the first time I looked for a recipe, the recipe literally just said make the posset and eat it, and I was like, thanks, that's so helpful to me. But in other ways they document life in terms of, you can find accounts in them, you can find lists, you can find inventories of clothes or objects, but they can also document kind of how these recipes were used, because people would annotate them. So you can see if there's a group of recipes that's to do with a particular ailment and people have written, oh well, this helped Johnny with his fits, I think is an annotation I've seen before. You can see how it's documenting kind of like medical records within the family as well. And people also use them in the same way that family printed Bibles were used, to like document births or deaths or life events. So in that way they can be, you know, quite special and personal texts, and that can get quite emotional sometimes when you have a list of children that were born and then you see like a lot of them didn't live, or they didn't live very long. So
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the annotations, like, so what are some of the stuff you found?
So I found, so there's lots of different reasons to annotate a recipe, which might be that you've written it down and you haven't tried it yet, so then you annotate it with kind of your notes on whether or not it was a good recipe. So sometimes you have a tick or a cross or the words, you know, probatum s, like I've trialed this recipe, for recipes that are good. And then you might have biographical notes where you say, you know, this helped my sister in labour, or this helped my sister when she was with child. So you start getting not only the knowledge from the recipe itself, but the learnt knowledge that people have got through using them, which is really interesting. And you also, when we're talking about that kind of social networking through recipe exchange, you can, one of the funniest ones I've seen is I think there was a recipe, I think it might have been for a pie, where somebody got it from someone, written their name, because obviously you could then document, oh, I got a recipe from this person, so, you know, I have cool friends, I have, you know, friends that I want to be associated with, and someone had just written, crossed it out and just been, this is really bad, which I always think there must be a story behind.
I do that. Can I tell you, I've got recipe books that I've used a recipe for, and I was like, oh, that's shit, just crossed it out. So do not use under any circumstances.
Exactly, yeah. And then as I do that as well, and then if you pass that on, the next person who uses it knows not to waste their time with it. But I wonder if that person got any feedback for how bad their pie recipe was.
Or if there was nothing wrong with the pie at all and they just had a row about something else, so it was like, damn you, curse you and your recipe.
Yeah, or if there was nothing wrong with the recipe but the person making it made a mistake. That's something I think about a lot.
What's the weirdest annotation you've seen?
The weirdest. There's been an annotation of a recipe, or just an annotation in a recipe book?
Just in a book. One of the books.
There's a really funny annotation where, so often recipe books have claims of ownership in them, so they'll be like Kate Owen, her book, and the year, and maybe like a nice Bible quote or some nice decoration. But often people would just write, as they got recipe books and they exchange hands, they'd write their name in it so they could document who's had it. And there's a recipe book that's known as the Johnson Family Recipe Book that was owned initially by someone called Elizabeth Phillips, and underneath there's a note that says, you know, this was given to me by my mother, and it means stepmother, because this second owner married Maurice Johnson, who doesn't seem to be very happy that she got the book and not him. So underneath it says, you know, something like, this is I claim this book as my right, Maurice Johnson of Spalding, Lincolnshire. And obviously I don't know when, though, you know, what's the timeline of those things being written, you know, between the first or the second, even the second and the third annotation. There could be a while between it, but I like to think there was some kind of like argument.
Maybe it went down in like a divorce or a separation thing about who got to keep the recipe book, and that's his moment of glory.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics of it, but it just, obviously it says a lot, because he's obviously claiming that as his property, and there's all sorts of stuff to do with women's ownership of property and women's ownership of books, and how many women's libraries got absorbed into their husbands. But also he obviously thought, well, this is a family text, and it ended up being, you know, used into the 19th century. So he took it, but he did make good use of it. And he also was really he was involved in the founding of the Spalding Society, which was like a gentleman's society with intellectual interests, which makes me think, how many recipe books did men claim, or men or just family members use, that had information from the kind of domestic women's knowledge that ended up in kind of like semi-professional or professional male spaces? I think about that probably more than I should.
It's another rabbit hole from a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Random question, it's kind of on topic, maybe a little bit off topic, but for example, if you had, I don't know, 7 girls born into a family and you have this one recipe book, who do they end up giving it to? Was it the eldest? Is it the youngest? The one in the middle? The one that cooks the best? Can you answer that? Is that even possible?
I can hazard some guesses. I mean, one would be like, sometimes they were given as wedding gifts. So you might give a recipe book if you only have one and you have a daughter that manages to like secure a husband, you might give it to her. But we know that people had relationships with recipe books that they ended up with after somebody's died, before that person died. So there's a recipe book, I think Elizabeth Freke's recipe book. She had 2. She had one, Joanna St. John's. Anyway, somebody had a recipe book and she died. And when she died, she had a recipe book that was just medicine and a recipe book that was just culinary. And she split it up. So she split up her recipe archive. And then there was another family where she had a lot of children. I can't remember the name of the woman, but she in her will expressed that the recipe book should be accessible to all of her children, because she thought it was very important that every single one of them had access to it. And they could have done that by passing it around, but they could have just lent it to each other and started their own recipe books with the recipes from the original.
I really want to know, how does their usage change over time? Do you see that at all, or is it very much sort of a staple of the household?
Yeah, because they have such long lives, they tend to have lots of different uses. So a good example of this is a recipe book at Wellcome Collection that was owned by someone called Martha Hodges, and it was used as like a recipe book, but it's also got other stuff in it, like religious writings and just excerpts from different print sources. But on the front page there's just this mess of lots of different uses over time. So there's a really lovely note that says, this was our grandmother Martha Hodges' book, and then it has a little genealogy to say how she was related, or how they were related to her. And then it says her hand, she has written her signature in her own hand, or her name is in her own handwriting at the back of the book, and her brother was a doctor who had a book about recipes. And that itself shows like a massive respect for the text. So this was your great grandmother who is now gone. She obviously knew her stuff because her brother was a doctor himself. And go to the back of the book and go and look at her hand. And that to me says there was something special about going and visiting the handwriting of their great grandmother, in the same way that, people get tattoos of handwriting of loved ones that's passed on.
Mm-hmm.
But on the same page, there's just loads of marks where someone's just tested their pen. So I'm like, the text has kind of gone down a bit. And there's also people have copied writing that's on that page in a shakier hand. So also now it's being used as a place to practice your handwriting. So I guess as time goes on, the change in the relationship people have with it also changes, and they become more valued or less valued depending on who owns them.
There are special collections of these recipe books, aren't there?
Yeah. So there's a lot of them. So I deal with, or have dealt with in my research, Wellcome Collection, the Royal College of Physicians, London. But there's recipe books in special collections everywhere. Like Folger has quite a good amount. Penn University of Pennsylvania does. So they're all over the place. And using special collections is just so important when dealing with these texts, at least for me, because there is something about holding them, and I think we don't credit our hands enough when we're doing research as being knowledgeable, if that makes sense. So we just tend to think, we look at things, but handling these texts, you kind of get a sense of what they're like to hold. If they're, are they portable? Are they a text that actually might have had to stay in one place? How have they been used? If you open up the pages, do the pages themselves want to turn to a particular spot? What does that say about how they're used? If there's writing on top of writing, it's easier, at least for me, to look at that in person. That being said, I am super happy, especially now during the pandemic, that a lot of places have really good digital surrogates for recipe books, so Welcome and Folger being one of them. And also, I'm going on about how good special collections are, but that is an access issue, isn't it? Like, it's quite a privilege to be, that's why I pay through the nose for London rent, is to be able to touch this old stuff. It's not for like the transport system. So I do recognize that you don't really have to always see them to produce good research, but for what I do, it's really important.
What's your favorite recipe book that you found?
Oh, I think it is the Martha Hodges one, the one with all the writing on it, because it's just this text that just shows how many different uses it had, how these recipe books might actually be useful for lots of different reasons, a place of contemplation for people that you don't know anymore, that a name like Martha Hodges, you might have never met her, but you have her text. That text also has lots of doodles in it that I just love. Like, there's a house, like a really topsy-turvy big long house. There's some kind of animal, like I don't know whether it's meant to be a stoat or an otter or a dog, but it just shows to me like how life actually has kind of took place on these recipe books, as much as been documented by it. And especially the doodles, not to like be mean at the art level of whoever drew them, but they do sometimes look quite childish. I mean, I'm not an artist, so it could have been an adult, but I also like to create this fiction in my head that at one point someone was trying to do some work and their kid was being really annoying, so instead of like shoving them a tablet, they just shoved them this manuscript and go ahead, like, just leave me alone.
And Kate, thank you so much for joining us and giving us this incredible insight into some of these really old recipe books. They're just so interesting, and they can tell you so much about a person's life just by looking through the recipes and the annotations and things like that. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun.
Tell me as well that you plan to do a compilation recipe book when you're done with your PhD.
I actually have started my own manuscript recipe book that details all the stuff I'm making and all my experience doing it. So maybe one day that'll happen.
Brilliant, absolutely. You have to come back and tell us all about it when it does. Join us tomorrow morning for Pole Position, and then in the afternoon we'll be talking to Ted Hooton all about the Balkan Wars. Now, if you've ever had to write that essay about the causes of the First World War, you will have mentioned the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, but if you're like me, you have no idea what happened in them. This is why we invited Ted along, and he gives us a really good introduction, so don't miss that. Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year. We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.